Right, welcome back. Now, South Africa is facing economic challenges that have led to many citizens losing their jobs.
This government says it will soon allow workers to access a portion of their pension fund to help them deal with the economic impact of COVID-19. National Treasury says once an agreement on the matter has been finalised at NEDLAC, legislation will be tabled.
And last night, our sister news show, the Watchdog, unpacked the pros and the cons of this particular issue. And host Vuyo Mvoko spoke to Matthew Parks and Langa Madonko about this, and how some of that conversation unfolded is what we're going to show you now.
Finance Minister Tito Mboweni announced yesterday that he and his Treasury team were now more determined than ever before to make sure that they put everything that needs to be put in place to ensure that South Africans who have been hit hard by the pandemic are allowed to withdraw a part of their pensions to sort out some of their pressing challenges. Reaction from South Africans has been mixed. Our guest, Matthew Parks, has been part of year-long negotiations on this matter. He takes us through its origins and subsequent conversations that have been taking place at the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC. Langa Madonko is the Deputy President of the South African Black Securities and Investment Professionals, UPSIP. He's going to help us look at both the good and the bad that could come out of such a move. Let's welcome them. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you so much for coming through. Matthew, COSATU has really been driving this. Why?
Sure. Look, we've been faced with our worst economic recession in South Africa in a century. We had to shut down the economy last year, as we all know, because of the pandemic, and millions of workers not only lost their jobs, but also lost wages. So we needed to provide every single bit of support we could to workers who are experiencing huge difficulties. And of course, many workers who, even though they might retain their jobs, are experiencing huge levels of indebtedness, are falling behind the home loan payments, other payments. They're supporting large numbers of unemployed relatives. Yet many workers have got significant funds saved up in the pension funds, which they can only access upon retirement or if they resign from the work or are dismissed. Then they can cash out everything. So we have said, look, let's give workers some relief in this moment of difficulty so they can survive, so they can keep up with their debt payments, so they can take care of their families, and allow them a limited access to their pension funds. It is their money, and when they're in their moment of difficulty, they should be allowed some sort of relief to enable them to survive, to get out of this crisis. And it also would help benefit the economy, because this is money which would be spent in the local economy, it would be spent paying off the debts and so forth. It was a difficult road. At first, government didn't want to agree with us. Eventually, we persuaded Treasury. You may recall that in October last year, the Minister of Finance did make a commitment to Parliament in his budget speech to do exactly this. But we've been disappointed that since that time, government has yet to table a bill at Parliament to effect this, because this requires an amendment of the existing pension laws. That takes a bit of time. It won't happen overnight. But we were quite pleased yesterday when the minister did respond to us again to say, yes, he's going to do it. He's going to make sure Treasury does it. We hope government will keep its word and that we will see a bill in Parliament by the end of this year, so that this could come into effect in the second half or the end of next year.
Well, I'm glad you've raised the latter part of your input. The fact that there's, as far as you are concerned, the government has been rather tardy, on this one, which perhaps speak to the possibility that they were not keen on this in the first instance. And that, in fact, goes contrary to what many people have been saying today, that, this is a Tito invention or a Tito proposal, when in fact you are the ones who have been, driving this in the middle of a great deal of reluctance on the part of the government and some of the social partners at NEDLAC.
No, exactly. I mean, we raised this in May last year, more than a year ago. If government had moved to speed, by then it could have come into law already. In fact, when we also raised it at Parliament last year in our budget submissions, one of the Democratic Alliance members of Parliament actually drafted a bill, a private member's bill, providing for this. We had hearings in Parliament on that bill earlier this year. The ANC was quite interested and supportive of its objectives. Unfortunately, Treasury said they don't support it, that Parliament must wait for them to come with a bill. We are waiting. We hope they will not disappoint us again, because we don't have the luxury of time. As we've seen now with the violence in KZN and Gauteng, no one can predict when a crisis will happen. Equally, if you look at the levels of indebtedness of public servants and many other workers, it shows you there is a need to help workers, and workers should be allowed to access the money. We're also trying, Vuyo, to avoid a worst-case scenario where many workers do resign from their work and they cash out the pension funds, because that you can do under the laws currently. And that creates the worst of two scenarios, because one, the worker resigns his job and is unemployed. Two, they deplete the entire pension funds, which puts them in a difficult spot when they hit retirement. So rather say, let's allow them a limited access to the funds. They can retain their jobs. They can also take care of their debts and their pressing needs. And also critically, this is workers' money. It's not government's money. It's not the employer's money. It's workers' money, and we should trust workers to have enough sense on how to manage it and to take care of their families.
It is workers' money, as you say, but it is where it is for very specific reasons. Did you consider other options, perhaps?
Sure. Look, we've looked at and put together a variety of packages to give relief to workers, to the families, to the country, the economy during this period. We had the tax relief last year and having it again now for companies which are struggling. We managed to pump out over 60 billion rand from the Unemployment Insurance Fund, benefiting more than 5.5 million workers who have lost wages, whose companies were struggling during this period. Again, we've managed to get the UIF to agree to release another 5 billion rand for this current period, for the level 4 and level 3 restrictions, for the violence in KZN and Gauteng, etc. But we need to provide additional support, because each of these elements of support benefits certain categories of population. The 350 COVID-19 grant, which government has responded positively to our proposal to reinstate it, that'll benefit the unemployed person. So we need to look at a variety of tools to give a variety of relief to people. But also we were saying that we need to find the right balance, the sweet spot. We don't want to deplete the pension funds, because that will leave workers in poverty when they retire, forcing them to be dependent upon a small state pension. We also don't want to leave workers penniless or to cash out the entire pension. We don't want to see workers who've lost wages default in their home loans and have the banks repossess them. So we're trying to find the right balance. So we've said, allow workers the right to access up to 30% of their pension funds, allow them the choice whether to take out a loan against the pension fund or to take a simple cash withdrawal, but give them the choice, and then equally encourage them to save the remaining part, and encourage them to even to top up when they can later, when times are better. But right now, when times are at the worst in a century, we need to give every possible bit of support to workers, and this doesn't cost government a cent, because it's workers' money, it's not the state's money, and we appreciate the state has got very limited fiscal resources right now. So also saying this is what workers can do to assist workers and to assist their families in the economy.
Langa Madonko, let's bring you in here. He is the Deputy President of the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals, APSIP. Now, the reason we brought you in was to say, let's look at this dispassionately. Let's look at the pros and cons of what COSATU has really been running with. And it would seem, looking at the responses of the other social partners at NEDLAC, it's gotten traction. It's a matter of when this thing needs to be done, and as the minister said yesterday, he is now going to make sure that the parties don't talk endlessly. This thing must be done now, since everyone is agreeing to it. Let's start with the pros. What good will come out? What good comes out? Not just this. What good comes out of withdrawing your pension?
I think, thank you very much, Vuyo. I think the first point that I can make is that ultimately, as Matthew has said, pension funds are the deferred wages of the members. So ultimately, it is their money and it is their prerogative ultimately on what must happen to it and when it must be accessed. So I think the first positive that comes out of it is that we definitely are in a time of crisis. we definitely find ourselves in a period where there is a need for people to access additional liquidity in terms of settling debt. Some of the measures that have been put in place to allow and to relieve the burden of the crisis on the members don't go as far as you possibly think they would. So people are left with numerous liabilities that they must service, whether it's the continued need to pay fees, the continued need to feed families, the continued need for them to service their liabilities, debt, housing bonds, and so forth and so on, remains and persists. So if the funds that are being withdrawn are going to be channeled towards addressing what are principal and fundamental needs of the worker in terms of how the money that is withdrawn is spent, then that's a good path. And I think we acknowledge and we accept that the crisis has left many people who particularly earn on the basis of the work that they've provided, unable to meet some of their obligations, where some of the employers have gone and said that they are also unable to meet their obligation in terms of paying out where the employees or the workers are not able to provide the service that they underpin. So ultimately, it does ease the burden in terms of particularly the workers. And then I think
so used wisely, it could actually be to the advantage, or at the very least relief to the person who is doing it. What would be the examples? What would be examples of the kinds of things you could do if you find yourself in that situation? In other words, you would rather spend it on what than?
So I think some of the examples are, we all continue to have the responsibility to pay for education for our children. We all continue to have the obligation to service some of the liabilities around acquiring properties. We all continue to have the obligation to buy food and feed families. We all continue to have obligations around healthcare and the well-beings of ourselves and our family members. And those are just some of the examples of some of the uses that this could be put to, taking into consideration where we find ourselves in terms of the fact that some of the worker base might not be earning in this environment. So the opportunity to withdraw in that environment might mean you are able to continue to support, sustain your living environment.
Let's talk a bit about the bad.
So I think from the perspective of what could potentially be the harm that this would do is one, we can't guarantee that the resources and the income that is withdrawn will be used appropriately. And it's at the discretion of the withdrawer to then determine how they will ultimately use those resources, and you have little or no control after it's withdrawn. Secondly, I think it does have an impact, particularly in a country like South Africa, where one of the big talking points has always been how pension funds at the point of retirement for members, the amount that is provided might not be sufficient for them to actually live out the rest of the period after retirement in terms of what they have in savings. I think the number that is touted generally around how much each pensioner might receive in terms of their retirement provision is quite low. It's about 120 to about 150,000 per member in the country in terms of what is the average pension savings that one would receive on retirement. And that in of itself is a challenge. And then the third element is that I think, speaking particularly to the government initiative to drive infrastructure spend, infrastructure is an illiquid asset class that takes quite a bit of time for it to pay out the full amount that is due. It does mean that from a pension perspective, you'd have to be rethinking how you allocate your investments. And you probably want to find yourselves in the more liquid asset classes like equities and preferably cash in anticipation of a crisis and in anticipation of a withdrawal by the different members at the different points where they have a need to access their pensions.
Last one, very quick one from me, Langa. Just two questions that I can take from social media on Twitter. Poshian Gomonde is asking at what can these pension withdrawals be taxed? If yes, would that be fair because it's borrowed money? And she's also asking at what interest? Do you know when?
I think that's a question that's better posed to Matthew in terms of how he sees that playing out. But ideally, I think because it's a relief measure, you'd be anticipating that there would be minimal or maybe no tax in terms of how that is applied. Or are you looking at it in the same way that you treat a standard early withdrawal from a pension fund, and the tax principles that apply there would be the ones that apply? But let me throw the live snake to Matthew and see how he handles it.
Matthew, I'll give you the last word on that.
No, sure. Look, that's something that we've raised in our submission to Parliament and to Treasury. Look, currently your pensions are tax exempt as part of government's effort to encourage savings, and that's a correct approach. But I think also, as you know, as my colleague is saying, that people are withdrawing or want to withdraw in the moment of greatest need. And the last thing you want to see them is that small little money they have been saving up being further reduced by taxation. So we think ideally, there should be no tax. It should be tax exempt. You shouldn't be taking money when people are struggling to feed their families, to save their homes, to buy medication, etc. But if it has to be a compromise, then it should be at a minimal rate so that you don't avoid, if some poor person is getting 20,000 Rand or 15,000 Rand, you don't see it being depleted by heavy taxation. We think government can afford to be lenient because these are workers who are really struggling not because they want to buy luxuries, but simply struggling to save their families home, to buy food, to buy medicine, to make sure the kids can get to school, etc. So there needs to be a progressive and a fair compromise, but one that must favor the workers and not favor the state.